So I'm really delighted that everybody was able to join us today to hear from John Gillis. John Gillis is a senior conservator at the library at Trinity College in Dublin. And he's been teaching book and paper conservation for 20 years at programs throughout Italy. I just was hearing more about, actually. It's pretty amazing. And I don't want to take up a lot of the time that he has because it's much better spent with his talk. But the title of John's talk is Treasure from the Bog, the Fadden More Psalter. So join me in welcoming John.
Thank you, Ellen, and it's great to be here. As you may know, I'm spending some time in GRI, the Getty Research Institute, carrying on further research. I've kind of been involved with this project, gosh, for 10 years now, and it's a project I'm engaged with almost daily, and it'll probably follow me to my grave, I'd imagine. But it's a fascinating project, and you know, it's always a pleasure to get the opportunity to share it with you. So here we go. It's a good story. So on the 20th of July, and this is actually coming up with its 10th anniversary, in 2006 in the townland of Fadden More. This is in Tipperary. It's kind of bang in the centre of Ireland. A discovery was made in a bog. This was a private bog, not one of the state-owned bogs, when the driver of one of these big machines for harvesting the bog discovered what he thought he saw was a book. This is kind of an interesting little shot. This is a normal map, mid-17th century. This is kind of just to put it into context. You can see on the map that Fadden More Bog was around at that time. And it was bogland at that time. You can see some roads, some small churches. So it's kind of evidence of activity. But the kind of interesting point about this map is this 17th century map. At this stage when the map was made, Fadden More Psalter was already 700 years buried on this spot. So it kind of gives you a sense of the longevity the manuscript has survived. This is the bog itself, Fadden More Bog. And as a city boy, I didn't know very much about bogs, so I had to kind of educate myself. I didn't Photoshop the sky. It was a good day. You do get the honor. But what you see here is this is how they farm these commercial bogs. They dig a ditch, and then they take away from the wall of the ditch and cut the turf into lozenges. And you can see it stacked up there on the side. This particular bog was a privately owned bog. A couple of guys called the Leonard brothers, and it had already produced archaeological material in the past. Back in the late 1990s, they unearthed this large leather satchel with timber handles on the side. And this lives in the National Museum. It's dated to the 7th and 9th centuries. It has the affectionate nickname in the museum of Tina Turner's miniskirt. And of course, there was speculation that they tried to associate the two because it came from the same location, that perhaps the book would belong to the bag. But this is clearly something more industrial, more robust, possibly for I don't know, hung off the side of an animal like an ox or an ass, perhaps. But it gives us an idea of activity. Archaeological finds from bogs in Ireland is at a very high level because there are components within the bog itself. Sphagnum moss. This has a kind of antibiotic effect, if you like, on the proteins that you get in organic material. So you get survival of organic material that you wouldn't normally get in soil. It has a kind of almost tanning effect. It turns stuff into leather of a sort. Also, of course, it's more or less anaerobic, so you don't get the same problems that you might do with microbiological growth, although you do get some level of it. This is the delicate piece of machinery that discovered the book. And, as I say, this is a privately owned bog. It's not a state-owned bog. The vast majority of bogs in Ireland are state-owned, and they're farmed on a vast basis, and we've lost much material because of that. But it's kind of a more gentle process here. And the guys who actually own the bog developed this system themselves. You can see the backhoe bucket face. The advantage of it, the backhoe bucket faces the driver, so as he takes a slice out of the wall of the ditch, he's actually looking into what he's just taken away. I had a chat with this guy, a lovely fella called Edward Fogarty, or Eagle-Eyed Edward as I call him, and I said to him, like, what made you think you found something, what did you spot? And he said, well, John, he said, I saw something brown. So, you know, you have to, as I say, you have to commend his eyesight and his attention to detail when he's doing that all day long, thousands and thousands of times. So that, these guys also, the museum has a kind of a scheme of informing workers of the land that might come across archaeological material, what to do, how to react, what are the initial steps to take. Because we know how vital that can be to the survival of this sort of archaeological material. So they immediately covered up everything under wet bog material again and contacted the museum. So we had a kind of hit squad sent down from Dublin almost that same day. This is what greeted them. It was almost identified it was identified on spot by the head of collections. He was one of the team that went down, as well as the conservation, as a psalter, a book of psalms. And the kind of giveaway text here you got in Valley Lacramara, the Valley of Tears from Psalm 83. And this was, in fact, this is the image that kind of flashed around not only the national media, but worldwide media when this was found. It's such a revelation this was, because it is the first unknown medieval book to be discovered in 200 years. So that's the sort of significance we're dealing with here. Reinl is now director of the National Museum, so it didn't do his career path any harm either. He did quite well out of it. Yeah, so that was it. A little bit about the manuscript. The manuscript itself is written in long line. That's to say, it's in a single column on the page. Whether there's more than one scribe, we don't know. You're not looking at it from a typical paleographical point of view, because of the survival isn't great, as you can see the sort of damage we're dealing with, but it contains the sort of things you'd expect to see in an early medieval manuscript. It's got scribal errors, and the hand was identified almost again straight away as insular or Irish majuscule. This would be a typical hand. You had a majuscule and a minuscule, two typical hands for this period. And this is in that way. The manuscript itself has been dated to the late 8th or early 9th century, and that's based on paleographical and art history details. We have a look at a little bit of art there is within Fadden More Psalter. There's not much, in fact, in the way of decoration. This is no Book of Kells or Book of Durrow. This is, as I was just saying earlier, this is our medieval paperback. This is a working copy, a usable copy. And in fact, for that reason alone, its survival is all the more miraculous. This is what was presented to me when I went on secondment. I was employed at Trinity at the time, and I was seconded to the National Museum for as long as it takes to conserve this. It took maybe 5 years in the end. They didn't think it was going to take quite that long. But, and again, with the National Museum's habit for nicknaming things, they titled this the Lasagna, for good reason. So, this is what I was presented with. And I thought to myself, it's almost too big, it's almost too much to take on and take in at a go. So I kind of had to set myself goals. I said, well, if I'm approaching this as a book conservator, what would I hope to achieve? Because, you know, in this sort of condition, we had long and in-depth discussions about, we could just save it as an archaeological object. We could just freeze it here and now, stabilize it and keep it. But, as I said earlier, it's not, you know, this is the first manuscript we've known to come to light in 200 years. It was too good an opportunity not to try and unravel it, not to try and glean from it. So I set myself the goal of, I said, well, if I can establish the makeup of the codicology of the book, if I can figure out how many pages were there, how many gatherings, how were the skins orientated, of course it's on vellum, as you would expect for an early medieval manuscript, then I'd be happy enough. Now that's the sort of process you would often go through when you're working with a medieval book, is you make up what we call a collation map. You know, work out how the book is put together. It's normally a process that takes you maybe with a tricky manuscript a month or so. So took 2 years for me to come up with the collation map for the Fadden More Psalter, and that's it there. As you can see, it's rather erratic. So you're looking at the 5 gatherings, and to give you kind of a brief overview of what it is, you've got 5 choirs. There's 2 choirs that contain 10 leaves, first 2. There's a 12, a 13, and a 15. So that gives a total of 60 folios. There's no fly leaves on this manuscript, and the layout of the manuscript itself doesn't follow what we call insular practice. It's not consistent in having the hair side of the animal, and you can see the hair flesh identified there, on the outside of each choir, and nor has it got the consistent hair flesh, hair flesh, hair flesh. This is an insular tradition of how they would make up the choirs. It also ignores what they call the continental, or Gregory's rule, of facing light with light. So when you open 2 pages, a flesh side always faced the flesh side. So you had a kind of homogeneous look to the manuscript. This is, if you can, I don't know if you can make it out, you can see the hair flesh identification down the right hand margin is completely ad hoc. And that, my friends, is the best Irish tradition. They seem to do this all the time. They just seem to completely ignore the rules and put it together whatever way they like. So it's almost become an identifiable feature of an Irish manuscript that it'll be completely chaos. And so it is. So, yeah, I did one more point about that. The manuscript itself is calfskin vellum. Every Easter manuscript we know is on calfskin vellum. It's another kind of identifying point. I still spend my days hoping to find a sheep or a goat, but to date, all I found is calfskin. Even in you know, that Easter effect kind of also makes its way to our offshore neighbours in the UK or England. But down south you will start to see the Roman influence, and you will see manuscripts maybe either brought over or made under the influence of the continental style, and you will see some of them perhaps on sheep or goat skin. But all our insular manuscripts from the early medieval period are on calfskin. To make this book, where you would get about 2 bifolia off each skin, off each animal, for a manuscript of this size. It's 300 millimeters by 230, so it's kind of A4-ish in size. It's quite a large format book. So it would take about 15 animals to produce the Fadden More Psalter. Yeah, right from the get-go, there was speculation of, well, how did our manuscript get to where it got? You know, what was it doing in the middle of the bog? Although it was in the bog, and we've seen, you know, it was in the bog in the 17th century, it was a bog when it was deposited, and that's a very important point. The bog was already there, the bog didn't develop around it. There are no towers, these are pathways, which in early medieval times they used to make so they could traverse bogs. These wooden pathways, there's no archaeological evidence of that within kind of 100 yards. So this is kind of run. So it fitted very nicely that you know, this, again, the media latched onto it quite quickly of some poor monk, you know, making his way across the bog while being pursued by some sword-wielding Viking and burying his book and thinking I'll come back for that later, and then forgetting where he put it, maybe, I don't know. But it led to interesting speculation. We're still not quite sure how it got there. I can tell you one thing, it wasn't dropped. It didn't fall off something, because there is supporting archaeological evidence around this, which again, with time constraints I won't go into too much detail, but there is other material that suggests it's a deposition, it's not a loss. Well, it didn't just fall off. Yes, as I say, you know, there's a very well established and very skillful team of conservators working in the National Museum's Conservation Department, so you're going to know what they need me for. But I was bringing knowledge of books, plus one other thing. I was bringing knowledge of vellum, or parchment. The objects conservators in the museum are quite used to dealing with leather, organic materials such as leather, but vellum, although it's coming from the same source, is a very, very different material. It's not tanned. With leather, you have a cell structure that's almost vertical, a vertical cell structure. And to stop any sort of deterioration, to stop the putrefaction of it under adverse conditions, you fill, once they flay from the animal, you fill it with a substance, the tanning of the skin to turn the pelt into leather. And that stabilizes the cell structure because you fill this gaps between the cell structure. With parchment, it's a completely different thing. Nothing is added. They flay it off the animal, the same thing, they dehair it in the same way. But rather than fill the gaps between the cell structure, they draw it into what they call a low angular weave. They draw the cell structure to almost a horizontal plane. So it's under extremely high tension. And then hold it like that till it dries. And that's what gives you this hardened surface that they can then use to write on and to ruminate. So I wanted to know what happens to over 1,000-year-old soaked vellum when you try to dry it. Because when you Google vellum bog, not an awful lot comes back. So we were kind of out on a limb. So we got this tiny, tiny piece of vellum we found away from the manuscript, and that's it outlined. I traced the outline, and we just allowed it to air dry to see where we were. And that's what it dried to. That's the sort of shrinkage we were dealing with. So from that to that. So we knew we had a kind of a challenge on our hands, to say the least. And it was, as I say, it was also the kind of reason they brought me on board. So to kind of touch on again, without going through the whole trials, you can read more about this. I published on just the dewatering process in the AIC journal from 2014 and also the ICON journal. But to kind of give you a quick overview, we decided that what we try and do, water was a problem. Water as a solvent, if you remove it, the unbound water within the skin, when you remove it, because of its surface tension, it drags this cell structure with it. That's what causes the shrinkage you saw there. It's dragging the cell structure with you. If you can replace the water with something with a lower surface tension, more polar, then remove that instead, then you have a better chance of controlling that shrinkage. So that's the kind of path we took. We also knew we had to physically constrain it. So there were two elements to it. Changing the solvent that was in it from water to something else, and physically controlling it while the drying process took place. They were the two parallel experimental areas, and that took months and months and a lot of trials.
Yeah, this is one.
To kind of shortcut it, we ended up choosing denatured alcohol. So we would support each fragment, and you see the fragment there supported between, it's sitting in bonding sheets. This is a non-woven polyester, wonderful material. Sat in the bath of denatured alcohol, and we would just take specific gravities until we thought we had an exchange. It was a bit kitchen chemistry, but it did the job, you know. So we had now alcohol-saturated fragments as opposed to water-saturated fragments. The other thing we had to do then, as I say, was physically restrain it. And we tried also the thing on vacuum tables, under weight and blotting, and we eventually arrived at using a vacuum machine. So once we had the fragment in vacuum, or saturated in alcohol, then to take the alcohol out, we wanted to hold it, we wanted to constrain it. It's the same way as when they're making the skin. You see these medieval engravings, and you see the skin stretched out inside a frame. It's not the same purpose. They're holding it in tension while it dries. So how do we do that? We couldn't do it with this. If I'm working with a medieval manuscript and we have to hydrate it to remove distortion, then we use clips and pins in that, again replicating that medieval system of restraining it around the circumference. This poor material wouldn't withstand that. So we had to find some other way of restraining it. And that turned out, the best way to achieve that turned out to be to pull it in vacuum. So we would place the fragment, now alcohol saturated, between blottings and pull a vacuum. And the clever thing about pulling a vacuum, it's not like just squishing. What you're doing is you're removing all the gases from an enclosed space. So the pressure is actually just, it's atmospheric pressure. Pressure is even, it's one bar, it's what's all around it. So it's not squashing this way, it's even on its edges, you've got that identical pressure. And because it's between blottings, you get a natural kind of movement of the alcohol from the fragment into the blot. And that was the procedure we developed to then go through step by step. So this just gives you an idea of the sequences. We then had to repeat that several hundred times. And that's where we arrived. So it would start, I'd go in and have a chat with my manuscript and say, okay, what can I have? Let me have a piece here. And you'd find your way in and you would tease something away, and I would get something like this. Put it on my bench, and then try and work it out. I have to say, prior to this course, we were recording. I tried to work out as much information as I could about what folio was which before I took time. I mean, again, I have a whole other lecture on the recording aspect of it. It was a huge part of the project. So I didn't just kind of take a book and say we'll figure it out later. We wanted, conservation is destructive by its nature. Always remember that, once you move something from where it was, you're losing information. So you've got to bear that in mind. So this is a typical kind of chunk of material I would get on a given day. You would then open that out. And invariably that would be, a choir, a gathering. And these are like, if you think it back to the collation map, this would be a typical section. And we've got all the information. Now what you see, we've got some interesting things happening here and visible here. Here you see ribbons. This is actually the head of the center of a bifolio. And it's, what you're seeing is where the material, where the manuscript was peeking out from its cover and exposed to the bog material, you get the survival. It's in effect, again, the sphagnum moss are getting this tanning. Where it was buried deep within the manuscript, inside the cover, you get the gelatinization and you get the loss. That's why we have about 50%. But with careful recording, and because we're working with a known text, I was able to identify, by identifying the psalms and then positions, I can still tell you what bifolio this is, even without any text, simply because of its location and its adjacent piece of vellum will have information. It was that sort of work constantly. You can see here, well, is that just a lot? Have we just lost the other half of that bifolio head? But examining that under magnification, I see a cut edge. So that told me I had a single page, which there was throughout the manuscript. And it was that sort of work, building up the information as we went. Then clean it. So you would clean each one individually. The kind of wonderful thing about cleaning something that's saturated in water is you can't get any wetter, so you can just clean it with water. But you would end up, there's a lot of debris on the surface, seed pods, fragments, plant fragments, leaves, roots, and I was able to kind of brush these away in a kind of flooding water where the material was sound, but usually I would end up with fine tweezers and just picking off seed pods by the thousands. And they're also transparent when they're wet, by the way. But man, do you see them when they're dry, so you know where you miss them. I started without glasses, by the way. So this process will be repeated. You flip it over, and then of course repeating yourself. Again, it's sitting on a sheet of bondina here. Without this material, I doubt we could have managed to achieve anything really, to be honest. Once it was clean, it was mapped, and I'd take datum points so we could control and see any sort of shrinkage. I'd also record the fold area on the back fold where it's extant there, because often after the drying process it wasn't as clear where the fold was. But you would see a little kink in the vellum at this point. So again, careful recording was essential to the whole project. And there's our vacuum machine. So once we had it ready, it was placed into its package, its vacuum package, and there you see it in the package. These are these specific designed bags for holding a vacuum. They're polyethylene. I got some very good, from the States, 100% cotton blotting. And that was placed in the bag, the fragments in there with it, placed in the vacuum, pulled in the vacuum, take it out, leave it for, depending on the size, anything from an hour to a couple of hours, open it up, remove it, and then if need be, replace the blottings, replace it and put another vacuum. Then, slowly but surely, I should mention at the cleaning stage, I would actually start to introduce the alcohol. so you don't get, there's this idea of toxic shock sometimes of changing material, so you would introduce the alcohol as part of the cleaning process. I would then take it out and take away the vacuum bag, new fresh blottings under lightweight, change blottings again after a couple of hours, blottings even lighter weight. So the idea was to bring the fragment back into equilibrium. The bound water is still in there. We didn't remove that. It's very difficult to remove bound water from organic material like this. But the unbound alcohol would now evaporate out. So you would slowly bring it. I didn't want something that was had to be kept in some sort of really special conditions in order to be reviewed. What I wanted to do was bring it back into equilibrium with its environment around it. And there you see our dry fragment. And as you can see, looks nothing like we'd expect when we talk about that in this wonderful creamy material that the monks slaved over. We've got this kind of brown, lumpy material with text on it. But this is the process that allowed it to survive, if you like, because it's as I say, it's been semi-tanned. It's almost turned into a kind of a type of leather, if you like. So we'll put up with that. But of course, that's 50% of the manuscript. The rest of it did what it expected to do and dissolve. You know, if you're 1,000 years in water, you're not going to be in the best shape coming out to the side of it. So we had to go find or see if we could figure out what happened to the rest of the material. But there was a curious byproduct to all of this. As I say, when I'd be separating out a piece, you would work your way in and you could feel intact material, you could feel you were working with intact material, and you would kind of hit a bump, and you were hitting a mass. Rather than clearly defined strata, you're hitting a lump of material. And this is where we, so yeah, I'll come back to that, because this is something else. And this is what we found at the other end of this. It appears that we talked about the effects of the bog having a preservative effect on development. So we have a tanning effect. Within the material used to write the manuscript, iron gall ink, you have similar components. You've got those same tannins, well, similar tannins. And it would appear they had a similar effect. So where the manuscript, this is a bit you need to focus on, where they have written on the vellum, with the pen, with the iron gall ink, that's introducing that tannin exactly where the pen is striking, or the quill is striking the surface of the vellum. Everything else around it is exposed if it's not protected by the bog, if it's tucked inside. So I could start to see these forms, but of course it's all now, bogs are very fluid places. It's not like being buried in soil. You get a lot of movement, you get a lot of water changes, you get a lot of movement, physical movement, structures. And in fact our manuscript was sitting in there's these odd plants you get growing in bogs called tussocks. These are like plant material with kind of ball-like roots. And often when they're extracted, they leave a hole. And it appears our manuscript was actually sitting in one of these holes. So it was literally sitting in a pond of water for 1,000 years. So it had a lot of debris, a lot of plant material mixed up with all this glue. So I went fishing, and this is me beavering away, trying to figure out manuscript material from bog material. And this is the sort of thing that I come up with. And you can see, yeah, they all seem to assemble themselves in circles. I don't know why that happened, but this is something I did. But you can see what we've got. What we have are letters. These are letters from the manuscript. This is where the ink has struck the page and has had that preservative effect. All around it has dissolved out. But we're left with this. Then you can see interesting features here. There's an enlarged letter. This will be at the beginning of a psalm. So you've got this enlarged letter. We have bits of, you know, almost complete words surviving, individual letters, all sorts, down to actually partial letters. Because if you think of when you're writing, particularly with the insular hand, it's done in very specific strokes. So even if you're doing your S and you do that, then the joint between the two is the weak point. So we had them breaking up, so we had partial letters, we have little lines. We've thousands of bags of them, I keep arguing for eBay, you know, I'm sure we can make a few bob. So we got lots and lots of these. And there was one thing that, again, this goes to the recording side of things. I worked out a character count. Fadden More Psalter is very consistent in the way it's laid out. It's very different in the way of addition material. So if I had the Vulgate Bible beside me, I could more or less figure out what should be where in the manuscript by working out a character count per line. It's an average thing, but it seemed quite accurate. The other thing we had done is we had the whole project captured digitally at a fixed focal point. This was really important, right? So every fragment, not just these large ones, but the small ones, was captured as we went through it. Because it became clear that I would be able to start to identify some of these fragments you saw in the earlier slide, and maybe put them back in place. So if you have a character count, one thing. If you have a known text, you've got Psalms, so you know wherever you just look. I mean, you know, I need references to my Psalter, I can tell you, I didn't know them by heart, like the poor novices that had to learn them. But, so you would work it out. So I could more or less position things. So when I would find fragments, I could put them in place. Exactly. Even if they didn't make direct contact with the piece above, because I'd worked out my character count. And of course, what's happening here is I'm also doing it digitally. I would do it with the actual fragments, but then I would actually go and do it to the digital image. And if you look here, here's where I cut them out as a kind of Photoshop exercise and dropped them in place. The additional work here was, of course, I had to do it twice, because on the actual one, you've got your recto verso, but on the digital one, you've recorded it recto and verso, so you have to actually do it twice. That's the sort of thing on a day-to-day basis, you know. And here you see some of my identified fragments yet to be put in place. You know, so you were always hopeful for some unusual bit of text. If you found a Deus, you know, or Colloquium, then you were in trouble because there's lots of them in lots of Psalms. But if you found some of the more unusual words, then you had a hope of locating. As an aid, also, you had the hair flesh. I was able to work out the hair flesh orientation quite easily with this manuscript, thankfully, and that was useful, so you would know what side it should be facing on. That work still remains to be done, to be honest with you. We also had, so as I say, Fadden More Psalter, you know, is not a highly illuminated book, but it does have, the tradition for Irish Psalms was to divide them into 350s. These, you know, the oblates, the young novices in monastic orders were required not only to learn Latin, because don't forget, we didn't have Latin, we didn't have Roman occupation at any time, so they also had to learn the language, learn the Psalms off by heart. And the oblates, these young novices, would use the Psalter text. As an aid to that, in an Insular tradition, they used to divide the 150 Psalms into 350s. And often you find that in manuscripts, Insular manuscripts, that division is marked somehow. In the case of the Fadden More Psalter, they've marked the division using decorated lettering, enlarged lettering that you see here, or display capitals, as it's sometimes called. This is the beginning of Psalm 51, the Quid Gloriator, and you can see this large bowl here of the Q. Lots of individual crosses on the inside. You have the U and the I inside it, and then the D, and then the D, sorry, that's the I, D, and that's the G of the Gloriator there. You've got blocks of colours inside. You've only managed to identify one, unlike the ink, which of course, you know, chemically fixes itself to the surface. Pigments with their binders didn't survive. We managed to hold on to the yellow, and through XRF we identify orpiment. No great surprise, it's the kind of pigment you'd expect, but we got a nice partial peak for orpiment. We've even got we've got a bird's head. We've got this zoomorphic feature at the bottom here, not quite easy to make out. I'll make it easier for her actually. There we go. This is a reproduction by a well-known calligrapher, historian in Ireland. He reproduced it. So we have this kind of nice fellow bird's head. Okay. But you can kind of get a sense of what the manuscript might look like in its day, you know, its glory. Yeah, another feature of this, of course, many scholars were kind of hovering over my shoulder all the time as it were, just because they wanted to have a look at the text. But usually they're dealing with something they can make sense of easily and read, and it was difficult to read. Fadden More, as you can see, this blending of the two browns together. But I found often when it was wet, it was easier to, so I would take high resolution photographs. And some of the Psalter scholars worked from this rather than from the actual text. They found it easier to work with. But as it all became dry, then it became a bit more of a problem. So I foolishly or not took it on myself to have a go, if you like. So I downloaded myself a Vulgate Psalter text. This is Jerome's revision from the Old Latins, the standard version you'd expect for this period. And I went through it. And what I simply did, in a very amateurish way, I grayed out what we didn't have. I put it in blank. I just let the ink be blank where we did have extant text. And here you have psalm number, that's verse number. That's the folio on Fadden More, 9 recto. And work my way through the whole thing. So this, I'm providing this text to the scholars who want to work it out. What I also decided to involve myself with, foolishly or not, I'll probably live to regret this, but then I also looked for variants, because of course there are variants in Psalms. There are known variants, and when I would find a known variant as referenced in the Vulgate, I would highlight it in yellow, but where I would find unknown variants, which there are plenty, I would highlight them in green. So this feeds into, it's good because Fadden More then starts to feed back as well as taking information, you know, as a typical Psalter, because it's got very good provenance. It was in the one place for 1,000 years, we know where it comes from. You know. 2932, we have this really unusual survival. You've seen the typical survival of the Psalter, but we have one bifolio, this guy, 2932, it's not even a centerfold, that survived almost attack. And this gave me all the codicollogical information. It gave me the line count, I have pricking and ruling marks, I have complete backfold, which is a godsend for any codicologist trying to make sense of anything. And in fact, in here I found 2 vegetable fibre strands, so we know there was some sort of mechanical attachment. I personally believe the manuscript was only ever in individual gatherings. It was never attached to the cover, I'm almost convinced, and I don't think one choir was actually connected to the next. So there are like 5 individual gatherings. But the gatherings were held together with what they call choir tackets, is my opinion. And we got the line down. So we were very, very lucky to have this. You can see this horizontal trauma. I believe this is old trauma, because you get these 2 pieces lived in different environments in the bog. Hence you've got this higher degree of deterioration in the lower half and not the upper half. So this tells us we had some sort of historical damage. Not just, you initially thought it was just from the bucket hitting it, but this suggests to me that this is old damage. And we have 2 micro-environments. So that's the manuscript, but the manuscript sits in something, of course. This cover sat underneath, and it was identified straight away as something unusual and not typical. The cover itself is a single piece of leather, tanned leather, so we've had no problem surviving in those conditions in the bog. As you can see, it's intact. It's 330 millimeters by 500, you would think I'd know by now, 530 millimeters. It's young cattle, and it's been creased at various points to give you this envelope, flat. There. I brought it with me. That's a replica of it, and you can see it there. So it's a very simple structure, very simple laid out structure. And we come back to that.
Is that the size?
That's exactly the size. That's
Okay.
identical to the size. Yeah, it's all the scale. I'm bigger than I used to be. So, as I say, it's been creased. There are 2 holes in the spine. We're not quite sure the purpose. One here, 85 millimeters from the head and tail, respectively. Again, unused look. They're punched from the inside out, 3-sided tool, a little bit of work with them. It's a typical tool of the medieval period. It leaves that kind of diamond-shaped hole. But they have a very unused look. If you push the pieces back down, they sit very neatly together. So it looks as if nothing was ever passed through it. You can see the black. It's got a black pigment. It's vegetable charcoal. It's carbon black, if you like. And that had a casein binder, milk protein binder. Attached to it are 3 buttons. Best guess is these guys are made of horn. They don't really seem to have a particular function. We're not quite sure why they're there. They're sitting on the flat. Later on, you see the Byzantine bindings, you can see some sort of attachment, and they're usually on the front cover, on the spine, and they're used for lashing something around to lock the book up. Here, we're not quite sure what the purpose is. The middle one is pointed, and the two guys are round. Numerology, of course, in Christianity was a big thing. They made some reference there. Of course, the number 3 is one of the favourites in that respect. So we were kind of figuring out, as I say, a lot of people looked at this binding at the initial stages, sitting underneath the manuscript, and they brought in experts from other disciplines, and every looked at it and went, "Ooh, it's not Western. This looks Eastern Mediterranean. It's Oriental. It has this Coptic look." And the reason they drew that comparison is there's so little surviving of extant. We have a reasonable amount of manuscripts from the early medieval period, but we have a tiny percentage of original bindings from that period. So when we see something like this, people immediately identify with known structures. And what they were identifying with are a set of Gnostic Gospels called the Nag Hammadi Gospels. These were discovered in north of Cairo in the 1940s. And they have this kind of system. They use this kind of single piece of material wrapped around the book. Now, of course, it predates Fadden More by 300 years. But it's known as a Coptic structure. And how they would attach, unlike Fadden More, their gatherings is by what they call this primary tackling. So these are individual strands brought through the centre of the backfold, out through the cover, and simply knotted on the outside. And forgive my rubbishy drawing, but it kind of conveys the message. So you've got these individual pieces, and that's how these manuscripts are put together. With the Nag Hammadi, there were what they call single choir codices. So it was just one choir, but later on we get this kind of multi-choir effect. And it was kind of accepted that we've got something exotic here. We have something that harks not to a Western structure at all, because we didn't have a parallel, but very much to a Coptic, Oriental, Eastern structure. And that was kind of interesting. So, there it is. We're excited about the exotic nature of it all. But then, I'm going to draw your attention to 2 illustrations here. Here we're looking at the evangelist portraits from 2 insular Irish manuscripts. Cadmug, right here, John, and McDernan with Luke. And these are, this guy is kind of 8th century, and this guy is late 9th century. These are, as I say, they're illustrations of evangelist pages, and both of them are holding books. If you zoom in on those books, I think it's not unreasonable to suggest we've got a similar structure to Fadden More. Now this becomes, I mean, obviously everybody was very well aware of these images beforehand, but nobody made the connection between the style of the book. This was seen as possibly some sort of decoration on the spine, but I think it's much more likely that it is in fact a similar structure to the Fadden More Psalter. Now here's the kind of crux. This is initially seen as something exotic, but here we're seeing it represented as the typical form of a book. Could it be that we had lots of these guys? They just haven't survived, because obviously you don't want to convey something exotic and weird that somebody's not going to identify with. You want to, if you're conveying this, not so much with Fadden More because it's a pocket gospel, so it's probably a personal book, but McDernan is a reasonable size, and so it may have been used on the altar, it may have been used for teaching purposes. So you want to convey something typical of book form. So it may be that this guy is actually something that we just lost track of over time, and that it may well be much more typical than we think now. We can kind of push the point a little bit. I do like this one. As I say, I mentioned earlier, centre button of Fadden More, rounded. We go back. McDernan, I think that's a reasonable an assumption that you're also going to ground up. So we have something very similar, and I have found other examples. Now, the kind of, in fact, this is kind of stuff I'm doing in Delhi at the moment. What's curious is, and it's only done recently, is I have found other representations of this sort of book. Sometimes it's with the evangelist symbol, so I've got a John as the eagle holding a book between the talons, and it's also this sort of book. But all the examples I found are only in Irish manuscripts. Now, I'm not being biased, I'm looking only, I am looking further afield, but I'm only finding them in Irish manuscripts. Could it be a quirky Irish thing? And I mean, gosh, if I had the time, that brings us back to a whole story of this idea of why was monasticism so strong in Ireland. This links across the Desert Fathers, you know, and the link with Coptic Egypt. Anyway, so we got it. So we've drawn our cover straight back to a kind of insular style rather than its exotic beginnings or you know, possibilities. So I'm cleaning away. As I say, we had to, at the end of the manuscript, as all the pages were being removed, we got to the last quire. The last quire, which we'll see a tiny little video clip at the end, just in a minute, had on it a fully illuminated photo in very, very poor condition. So I made the decision, as I worked my way down the manuscript, as I got to this last gathering, sitting on the cover, says, let's flip the whole thing. It'd be easier to peel the cover away from the folio, which is what you see, rather than the folio away from the cover, because it was in such poor condition. Once I did that, it means I had the cover to work with. And I'm cleaning up the cover, and I'm starting to see on its outer surface these bizarre incisions, random incisions on the surface. So, after much sweat, toil, magnification, and examination, I discovered this. There are over 30 trial motifs inscribed, I add, with a tool that I haven't yet been able to replicate the sharpness of. A 10A scalpel blade doesn't go near it. This is incredibly fine detail. I mean, the rubbish, from the point of view artistically, they're what we term trial motifs. You know, as I say, this is, you know, my kind of slightly light-hearted slant on it is this: as if Insular Monthly came in to the monastery with the latest designs, and they're having a go. You know, they're having to do. So you've got some interlaced pattern here. It's kind of all gone wrong in the middle. We have some key step patterns here. We've got, you know, an abysmal attempt at some curvilinear work here. Some reasonable ones. We've got a reasonable one there, and this to me is all representative of decoration you see in manuscripts, not for covers of books. This is what you would see penned or illuminated, particularly in borders. You know, particularly this guy here, I found several examples. It's not difficult to find examples of. Curious point on it though, this is the spine, obviously here. Nothing on the spine. What's that kind of telling us? To me, the book was closed when they're doing the duty, and the manuscript was probably in it. Which, you know, it kind of gives me another view of the sacred word of God and how sacred the book was. These guys are doodling away on it. You know, this is, and there are several other marks on the cover. There's cut marks where they were using it, probably on the underside when they're creasing the skins or when they're trimming the skins. This was kind of their cutting mat, if you like. It shouldn't be a fit for all. So there it is. That's it. As I say, it's quite stable. I should just quickly mention for stabilising of this, for the dewatering of this, we went for a much more standard archaeological approach. It was put into 15% volume glycerol. We had the exchange there, and then we went for sublimation. We vacuum freeze dried it. We vacuum freeze dried it in a 5-meter vacuum freeze dryer used for drying Viking ship timbers. Poor little thing was lost in there. It looked terrified, but it sat there for 2 weeks. But came in. It was you know, I did a lot of trials to see if we could do this, have the same approach of introducing nothing new, but really we would have to have chosen to dry it open or dry it closed because we wouldn't have the flexibility. This way we retained flexibility, and we haven't lost any colour or features. So, as I say, we're back with this idea of it being a local product. And I have it dry, and I'm doing a final cleaning, again chasing those elusive seed pods, and I'm working on the inside. And I'm finding this strange material. And I think, oh gosh, I've left a load of seed pods, or I've left a load of plant material structures, and I try to peel it away, but it doesn't want to come away. So I throw it under the microscope, 10 by, and nearly fall off my stool. Now I'm sitting in Dublin, I have a manuscript I retrieved from the centre of Ireland, and I said I'm looking at papyrus. How ridiculous is that? So I decided not to announce it as papyrus. That locked me up for sure. So I said I found papyrus-like material. Could we have it sampled, please? We had it sampled. Dr. Caroline Cartwright came over from UK, and inside surface of the cover of a manuscript, early medieval manuscript, was lying with flowers. Now, there's a lot we don't know, there's a lot we're unsure of. I can tell you one thing for sure: Paris doesn't grow on the banks of the River Shannon. So, what's going on? Why do we have this? If you go back to the comparison made 4.5 years earlier, when they said, oh, Nag Hammadi, and here are the Nag Hammadi library books, and you can see why the similarity, you've got the flap and the ties. And we look at the inside surface of the Nag Hammadi, we also have. So now we have this strange thing. Not only do we have the structure and its format and its layout, we actually have the same material. I should have the answer to that question now, unfortunately I don't. I mean, it's still a question. We're still trying to figure out what happened. You know, do we have the technology found? Do we have a monk who's gone on, you know, and we do have records, of course, of monks traveling in both directions. Quite early for it, but there are records in the annals of 5 Coptic monks buried in the north of Ireland. Or do we have maybe a pilgrimage, where we have one monk on his way to Rome for pilgrimage, meets a guy coming from one of the sites in Cairo, one of the monastic sites in Cairo, and he's hands him over, no, I'm finished with this, do you want? Because it's an interesting scenario that the manuscript itself, when we work out its format, doesn't exactly fit this. This cover is by about 1/4 of an inch larger. So it's not a snug fit, which is very unusual in that early medieval period. Everything was kind of cut the same size. So it leaves us with some interesting questions. To finish up, they followed me around for 4.5 years while I did this and made a DVD, which was broadcast on national television. So if you're, you know, whetted your appetite in any way, you can go see it. It is, of course, on display in the National Museum, should you want to see it. And just a taster, 30-second clip of the work. This is when I talked about flipping the manuscript over. Flipping the cover over, so we now have the cover facing upwards and folio 1 facing downward. I should say that because the camera crew moved in for this, of course, as did the Great and the Good from the museum, and a lot of people wanted to see this. I flatly refused to have them staring at me, so that they set up a video link. They're all in another room waiting for the big reveal, because as I said, we were aware there was a fully illuminated folio on the underside, but it hadn't been seen for, well, 1,000 years, I guess. So it was that period. And this is the robust, you can see the robustness of the leather cover in comparison. As a furniture conservator, put in place for effect. I gave this talk about a year ago, and very embarrassingly, I was wearing the same shirt. 9 years on.
Had too much to think about.
So this is again using the bondina as a support. This is this unwoven polyester and silicon mylar, and you can see starting to peek out now. This which would have been a glorious page, and there you see it, another burst feature, and we've got this interlinear. And that, friends,
maybe 2 questions. Unfortunately, I'm going to have dinner with John. I'm going to ask all my questions. Does anybody here have any questions?
It looks like you did incredible record keeping of the whole process. I was wondering, how can scholars view the pages of the material? How are they presented? Is there like a database, or how is that information?
Yes, that's a good question, and I haven't been asked that question before. Yeah, the museum recorded it as we went, and they recorded it as part of their archive. The archive, you can go, National Museum of Ireland, go search for it, and you can get access. If you wanted access to specific high-res images of any of the particular folia, then you just request it and they will give you access to it. So, unless you want to publish a course, then you're into a charge or a cost. But to actually just view it, you can view it through the National Museum.
Okay, so like the standard museum's data system.
Yeah, you might find, if you kind of go into the site and just Google, or put in the search Fadden More Psalter, you would get the kind of bump from all the work that was done, but you would probably be best to actually contact their photographic department. Valerie Dowling, wonderful photographer, works there. She would. It's all available. It is available.
More? Anybody else? And the bog is freshwater? Saline?
Yes,
Right, it's freshwater.
it is. Yes, it is. Very acidic. Kind of pH is 3.5. Yeah.
And I think it's so interesting that iron galling in this case was preserved.
I know.
As opposed to
Making hot iron.
yeah,
Sure. It is a curious thing.
Well, I know we are minutes away from a big other event in the use of this room, but please bring me